Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 57 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Buffalo Sabres, in which the Sharks have lost 4-2. Now, if you have been a Sharks fan for a decently long time, you would know that historically the Sharks have struggled when playing against the Buffalo Sabres, even, in the early 2010s when the Sharks were just like this elite regular season team, top of the Western Conference, maybe even top of the league at times. And on the other hand, the Buffalo Sabres were right at the bottom, potentially even last place in the entire league. The Sharks would still find ways to lose to this team. Ryan Miller, longtime Buffalo Sabres goaltender, seemed to always have the Sharks' number. Now, that curse, so to speak, has kind of calmed down over these past couple of years, especially since now the Sharks play the Buffalo Sabres twice every single year because of how the schedule is formatted these days. But here tonight, the curse kind of rears its ugly head, so to speak, and the Sharks will end up dropping this game to Buffalo. And this was actually a decently well-played game from San Jose, just as it has usually been over these past couple of weeks. The Sharks have been dropping a lot of games, but even in those losses, they've been making it interesting, they've been keeping it competitive, and it's usually just them not necessarily getting that extra bounce or maybe making one too many mistakes. And that was indeed the case here tonight against the Sabres. If we look at the first period, it did start off quite poorly. The first few minutes made it seem as though this was going to be an absolute rout. The Sabres are one of the highest scoring teams in the league, and they get this goal from Dylan Cousins, and so you're thinking, okay, this is going to be like a 6-1 loss. Kakkonen's going to fall back down to earth, especially watching this goal that he let in, which was a very bad one. You're thinking, okay, this is going to be a disaster, but the Sharks recovered extremely well. Not only did they play quite solid for the rest of the first period and limited to the Sabres to just 5 shots, but they would also get the game-tying goal from Svechnikov, and we would head to the second period tied at 1. And again, the Sabres not necessarily given a ton to work with. They were getting very few shots on net. Now, the shots they were getting were quite good, quite dangerous. The Sabres have an extremely skilled, albeit very young team, but the Sharks were doing a decent job of playing more so in the offensive zone than in the defensive zone. However, they would give up the go-ahead goal once again to Owen Powers, the former first overall pick, and so it was 2-1 Sabres, but they would manage to get the game-tying goal, Barabanov's 11th, and it would be 2-2 and a tie game once more come intermission time. Now, this is really where we saw the differentiation between these two teams, the differentiation between the Sabres and the San Jose Sharks, because in the intermission, the Sabres and the head coach of the Sabres is going to have such an easier time motivating his players compared to David Quinn motivating the San Jose Sharks players. Now, this isn't necessarily to say that the Sharks just came out and played terribly and they had no motivation and they're just not even trying. But when you consider the situations of both of these teams, the Sharks, they're not making the playoffs. Every single player in that dressing room knows that. And of course, they're playing for pride. They're going to put it all out on the line, sure, but they're still 4th last, and they're not necessarily putting in 100% effort every single shift, every single night. It's just not feasible. But if you take a look from the Sabres' perspective, looking at the situation revolving this game from around the league, the Sabres are fighting for a wildcard spot in the Eastern Conference. The multiple teams above them lost their games here tonight, the Islanders, the Capitals, and so they had an opportunity to close that few points gap to try and continue to make that push to the playoffs. So it's extremely easy for the Sabres head coach to walk into the dressing room and say, hey, we have an opportunity here, let's go out and win this third period. Compared to the Sharks, there's not any sort of opportunity, so you're just like, hey, let's try and win this game. And so in that third period, indeed, the Sabres were just better than the San Jose Sharks. They get the go-ahead goal once more from Jeff Skinner, and this time the Sharks do not have the game-tying goal in them, and eventually it is Alex Tuch who scores the empty netter. I will commend David Quinn for being more aggressive on the empty net this time around, learning from his mistakes against the Pittsburgh Penguins in that Penguins game. He did not pull the goaltender early enough. He had the opportunity, but he waited on it and then eventually ended up having to pull him with about 40 seconds to go when the Sharks didn't even have possession and was immediately punished. Here tonight, he pulled him with just under 3 minutes to go in the third period, so I liked that, but the Sharks still never really got anything established, and it was an Alex Tuch empty netter that ended this one. On to the players to talk about, we have the top line of LeBanc, Hurdle, and Meyer reunited after a strong performance in the previous game against the Vegas Golden Knights. LeBanc had started on the fourth line, got moved up to the first line in place of Bonino, and they looked very, very good here tonight. That didn't necessarily continue. Now, earlier on in the season when this line was together, a lot of times when they would have an off night, you could sort of look at LeBanc and say, well, he was a big reason why, but while LeBanc wasn't amazing here tonight, I felt as though it was kind of a down night for all three of these players. Not to say that there were zero chances in this game for this line. They did actually have a couple. LeBanc had like a couple of shifts where he got even some pretty decent chances. Meyer had some decent passing with Erik Karlsson and got a couple of decent looks as well. But the thing is that you are expecting more. The standards are higher for this top line. There's some very, very good players on it with Meyer and with Tomas Hurdle. And so you're expecting them to be your best line night in and night out. And they weren't necessarily that here. They were okay, but not great. When it comes to the second line, though, they continue to put up a strong performance here for the, I think it's like third straight game at this point. Barabanov, he stays hot now, his 11th goal of the season. I think it was only a couple of weeks ago when he was sitting on like just 6 or 7. So he continues to rack up points. Very, very impressive. Looks like he's going to be able to land somewhere around the 50-55 point mark by the end of this season, which is, of course, very impressive for a player who was originally picked up in a trade for Antti Suomela, who at last check, I don't even think he's definitely not in the NHL. I don't even know if he's in the AHL at this point. Might be back in Europe, which is not, a dig at Suomela, but it is incredible kudos to, I believe it was Doug Wilson who made this trade, one of his last trades as San Jose Sharks GM, and it was an amazing one at that. When it comes to the other two players on this line, also still getting some decent chances. Eyssimont actually had one really good look right at the end of the second period on a breakaway, had the opportunity to give the Sharks what would have been their only lead of this game, their first lead of the game, but ended up getting robbed by Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, and so that would have been like potentially a momentum changer. Could have seen maybe a different third period had that goal gone in, but because it didn't, the Sharks end up losing it. Not to blame Eyssimont or anything like that, it's just a rough situation in the end. When it comes to the third line, I actually thought the third line was okay, not amazing or anything like that, but they actually had some pretty good chances, and, my usual bar for the third line here is kind of low. I don't really expect much from any line that usually features Nick Bonino, so the fact that they actually had a decent game, played in the offensive zone, honestly more than they played in the defensive zone, is quite good. I thought Gregor in particular had a pretty decent game, not just like, he had that one odd man rush and then did pretty much nothing, but he had an odd man rush and then also was pretty good working in the offensive zone. So nice to see the third line do something. And then when it comes to the fourth line, we saw Lorenz, Svechnikov, and Lindblom together. Lindblom obviously moving down from the third because Bonino moves down from the first to the third, since Bonino going on the fourth line is absolute heresy in the eyes of David Quinn. This fourth line, Svechnikov did score a goal. Certainly nice job to him. I thought Svechnikov actually looked pretty good as a whole this game. The other two players, not necessarily as much, but the fourth line I thought was okay. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we had Harrington back into the lineup. This weird experiment of having Jacob McDonald on the top pairing with Erik Karlsson was just a one-game thing. It very much made zero sense to me why that would happen, and it seems as though there are many people in agreement with me, having watched the Sharks broadcast just today. So Harrington goes back with Karlsson, McDonald goes back with Ferraro, but the thing is that McDonald, he finds himself on this third pairing, but he's not getting played like a third pairing defenseman. McDonald almost 22 minutes of ice time, which is just absolutely absurd for a player like Jacob McDonald. It's crazy to me that he seems to have as long of a leash as Erik Karlsson does, while providing literally 1/100th of the offense that Erik Karlsson does. you watch Carlson, and he'll have the occasional bad giveaway. There were a couple here tonight, but you're never going to bench Erik Karlsson because he has so much offensive upside. So you immediately send him out for his next shift. You don't even think about trying to bench him in that situation. And for whatever reason, David Quinn seems to have the same type of mentality with Jacob MacDonald. There were multiple mistakes from MacDonald here tonight. Terrible mistakes from him on the goal from, I believe it was Powers, it was from Skinner. He overskates this one. He bobbles it. Then there were multiple other mistakes that didn't necessarily lead to goals, but still, it was just not a good night for MacDonald. But every single time he makes an error, he'll give the puck away in the offensive zone, things of this nature. David Quinn immediately sends him over for his next shift. You would think that MacDonald, in the 8 games he's played with the San Jose Sharks, would have like 5 or 6 points at least in a situation like that. No, that's not the case. MacDonald, who has been getting 20 minutes of ice time in like each of these past few games, only recorded his first assist as a San Jose Shark here tonight. And so the fact that he's given so many minutes to not even be that good is very weird to me. I mean, I can imagine a situation, I continue to harp on him even though he's not actually in the Sharks organization anymore, but you could just see how kind of like salty I am about that type of situation. But I imagine if Ryan Merkley were in this type of situation, making the mistakes that MacDonald is making, he would get nowhere near the over 20 minutes of ice time that MacDonald got here tonight. And yet, for whatever reason, MacDonald is given the longest possible leash, only behind Erik Karlsson. Now, when it comes to MacDonald's defensive pair mate, he didn't really do him any favors. Mario Ferraro, another rough game. It's actually so sad to watch Ferraro. He barely even looks like an NHL defenseman at this point, which is just very disappointing to see for sure. And what's so strange about it is that I don't even know if it's necessarily a good or bad thing, because the fact is that Ferraro continues to always put in like 100% effort into every single shift he plays. He's like one of the players on this team who seems to try the hardest at his game. And so the fact that his game is so bad, even though he keeps putting in that 100% effort, he's really trying. I don't know if that's like a good thing because maybe he can turn around, or if it's a bad thing that he's trying so hard and yet is still so bad. But it was a very rough game for Ferraro. He gets out-muscled and just absolutely out-battled by Tage Thompson on this second goal here, or on the third goal from Jeff Skinner, which ends up being the game winner. He has the poor coverage multiple times. He's just losing these races, losing battles, giving pucks away, making the incorrect calls in the defensive zone. It's tough to watch for sure. But on to the goaltender, we have Kaapo Kähkönen. After a heroic but tragic effort in the previous game against the Vegas Golden Knights, he is once again given the start here to the surprise of no one, even though James Reimer is indeed healthy enough to have backed him up here tonight. And it was a solid game for Kähkönen for sure. Obviously, this first goal from Cousins was not good at all. It was actually an extremely bad goal to let in. He recovered extremely well. The Powers one is technically savable, but I won't blame him too much on that. The Skinner one, he has absolutely no chance on, and he made multiple fantastic saves on a lot of the great chances that the Sabres had. Even in those first couple of periods when they weren't really getting too many shots, the Sharks were doing a good job at limiting those opportunities. They still were managing to get like some odd man rushes here or there. They actually had a penalty shot in this game as well. I think this may have been the first penalty shot given up by the San Jose Sharks this season, and Kähkönen came up with a big save on that one. However, at the end of the day, the Sharks do still lose this game, and you could technically say that this Cousins goal was a difference maker, and it was not a good one. So a good game from Kähkönen, but of course a far cry from his previous performance, which I guess you can't really expect from him night in and night out, but still. And that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, where they will go back to playing divisional opponents, and they'll face off against the Seattle Kraken, a team right near the top of the Pacific Division, of course rocking former San Jose Sharks goaltender Martin Jones, who has been not great for them, but he's been racking up the wins at the very least. The Seattle Kraken, you could say, have been outscoring their problems, kind of like the 18-19 San Jose Sharks when they had Martin Jones, so we'll see how the Sharks do then. Finally, can they get a win while playing well? Who knows? Class dismissed.